Finished training for the day? Time to fight post-workout fatigue with Core Power Protein Shakes. They're packed with 26 grams of high-quality protein to build muscle and electrolytes to help hydrate. The nutrition you need to help your body replenish, rebuild, and repair post-workout so you can power on to the next one. Champion your recovery with Core Power. Visit corepower.com to learn more.
The family that vacations together stays together. At least, that was the plan. Except now, the dastardly desk clerk is saying he can't confirm your connecting rooms.
Wait, what?
That's right, ma'am. You have rooms 201 and 709.
No, we cannot be 5 floors away from our kids.
The doors have double locks. They'll be fine.
When you want connecting rooms confirmed before you arrive, it matters where you stay.
Welcome to Hilton. I see your connecting rooms are already confirmed.
Hilton, for the stay.
Wish you could become a morning person? You know the type, up before the sun, early morning runs, first one to the office with donuts and a smile. How do they do it? Easy. With the new Galaxy Watch 8, sleep tracking and personalized insights from Samsung Health help you improve so you can wake up to a whole new you. One who, dare I say it, skips the snooze? It's possible. Train your sleep with Galaxy Watch 8. Learn more at Samsung.com. Requires compatible Samsung Galaxy phone, Samsung Health app, and Samsung account.
Welcome to this week's episode of Safe Room, a horror video game podcast and proud member of Bloody Disgusting's Bloody FM podcast network. I'm your host, Jay Krieger.
And I'm the other one, Neil Bolt.
And this week, we're unearthing the darker side of the web in our exploration of parasocial obsessions and misogyny in the analog desktop horror game Vile Exhumed from developer Final Girl Games, aka developer Car Cadaver, and published by DreadXP. In Vile Exhumed, players will uncover dark secrets found within the folders and files of a computer, leading the player to answers they may not wish to learn. And as an added content warning for this week's discussion, the game covers topics such as sexual assault and violence against women, which will naturally be referenced during the course of our chat. So this week, before we can even dive really into Vile Exhumed, there's a good amount of context, I think, that is required before even getting into the sort of nitty-gritty about what makes this an effective sort of piece of both interactive fiction, but also, you know, the commentary that is there within, and, you know, being another example of the horror genre being a vessel for something more than scares, right? Which is very often one of those things that we see the genre be sort of like, I suppose, typecast, right? The notion that horror can only be measured on the metrics of scares, which is something we actively go out of our way to kind of have conversations that prove the other, that there's actually a great deal to horror that has nothing to do with scares and whatnot. But I guess in sort of breaking down the context for Vile Exhumed, earlier this summer, you know, we were chatting about, and we took time during an episode of Horror Bites to chat about the mass censorship that was going on itch.io and on Steam. You know, both of those services essentially began delisting. Steam delisted about 100 games, whereas itch.io delisted about 20,000 games. And these were all under the guise of, you know, sexually explicit content, which, you know, we've now been able to surmise is not actually the case, right? It was mostly the fact that both of these services were bowing to the will of their payment processors, who were essentially enabling reactionary and kind of like hysteric social movements that were either online or otherwise. So did I kind of summarize that well enough, Neil? Was that more or less the gist of what was going on?
Yeah, I mean, that's what it boils down to. It was a bunch of nonsense that is still not really fixed, you know, in a lot of ways as well, despite explanations. Yeah, there's a lot that's happened in terms of itch, especially, and yeah, some bad, some good. It is a very out of the blue situation, and unfortunately, they were the latest target, and there'll be more targets, and it'll carry on, and it's just bloody annoying. But yeah, this was a victim of it, obviously, as well, in a way that was a bit, I suppose, the most high profile one, because there were so many games that, you know, were okay, there's small games on it that you wouldn't have necessarily seen much about. There's some more notable examples, but this Dread picks this up earlier this year. It had been a smaller game on its year before, and I mean that's the kicker straight away there. For this story, this very personal story that has to go to such dark places to explain itself. Getting Dread to publish it, looking forward to all that, having this big expanded version of it, and then basically not being able to sell it on those platforms because some people just decided that sight unseen we're going to do another Mary Whitehouse and decided no, this is shit, this is horrible, we don't like it, and because context and nuance for those kind of people don't exist. Like it's stupid, it's fucking stupid. And but the upside is this game, they did Kara did make it available to download, so everyone still has a chance to play it, which is fantastic, and I'm so glad about that. The annoying thing about that, I think, is the coverage around it hasn't really been there as much as I think it would have been had it had those platforms, and that's the sad sort of thing about it. The exposure this game could have got for what it does would have been so much better, I think, if it had those platforms, and we wouldn't probably have had to have this nonsense surrounding it as well. But beyond that, from here on out, we'll just be talking about the game, and what the game does.
Yeah, and I will say that for anyone that decides to check this game out, as you mentioned, like this game is free as shareware, and it'll be linked below this episode's post on social media. But people should know that there's also going to be the PayPal link there that if they choose to, they can kick some bucks over to the developer and whatnot to support this effort. And people should know that any donations that are given through that PayPal link, 50% of all the profits will be donated to the Red Door Shelter, which is a Toronto-based family shelter charity focused on helping families, refugees, and women who are attempting to escape violence. So if you see that PayPal link, much as we do with Horror Bites, we just love to champion work and providing a means for people to financially back games and single-serving experiences that might be free to play, but those developers still deserve they deserve some financial compensation, perhaps, for, these experiences, which, with something such as Vile, it being this very personal work that is, exploring uncomfortable themes and thematics and whatnot, but at the same time, they're very important conversations to be having nonetheless. But now that we've kind of given a little bit of context to Vile Exhumed, for people that are unaware, this is a game that basically you are essentially viewing a desktop of a computer, desktop horror, right? You've seen plenty of these with found footage films, but we have seen a slow increase in terms of games that perhaps utilize this more analog sort of viewpoint. But Vile really goes the extra length, I think, in terms of establishing that sense of unease, not from the sense of like, oh, this is a haunted computer or something like that, which we've seen a couple of times, more specifically in Horror Bites. But I think ultimately it's more than just the subject matter being uncomfortable. It's more about like digging through like the files and not really having a clear sense initially of what to do other than, hey, you're sitting at a computer and you're going to unearth basically these secrets that become even more disturbing and darker the more that you kind of like start digging into the guts of this computer that is very late 90s sort of coded, if you will. What was your sort of like first impression of Vile Exhumed and navigating desktop horror in this way?
Yeah, I mean, being late 90s was interesting for me personally because that was my first real time around the internet, and these places that you could find on the internet. So straight away, I was like very much intrigued by how well it replicated some of these sort of late 90s experiences I had. I mean, some of it even now, like that still exists in the internet, for the city pop-ups but like sharing sites and swap sites and things like that. Obviously much darker and more disturbing than your regular stuff. But yeah, it's weird to see how eerily accurate it is sometimes. And what it replicated for me most, I think, is the rabbit hole nature of the internet and not the computer that has kind of gone. It's like, sure, you can go down them to a degree, but I think with everything that's been shitified, in the last God knows how many years, we don't really have that same sense of wonder. Probably since mobile phones really, were the easiest way to go on the internet. But back in the day of just having a computer in a room and just like it being like this alien thing that you could just delve into and have these little places to go that were all new and fresh to you. It's like even going to places that were sketchy, you felt compelled. You felt you really want to sort of dig in and dive in. This is the extreme version of that. In my head, and but yeah, it's like it's the sort of stuff that would be in hushed whispers. Even then, of like the places that could be on the internet, stuff you just can't see. And again, one of those things that now everything is just all there, blah blah blah. You're saturated in it. Then it was like it really did just feel like there were bits of the internet you just couldn't see or find unless you knew the right people or went the right places, or the wrong people in the wrong places in many cases. And it was always exciting to just discover something new like that, even when it wasn't morbidly not great yet in this sense. So yeah, I think that was my initial impression, was really just how quickly I fell into my old ways in a way, just like really being engrossed in picking through this like that, which I think the way the narrative is handled with this is interesting in that context as well.
Yeah, I'll say for me, granted, when I was thinking about like the late 90s, like I'd 99, I was 7. So like I wasn't on the internet in that same way. But like to your point, I think what this game does a great job of doing is capturing a specific era of what the internet was like, and it acting as a time machine in that regard, right? That's not to speak to any of the really disturbing subject matter that's in this game. What it's speaking to, though, I think is like forum culture and the notion of going into these different corners of the internet that are, for hardcore hobbyists in, the traditional sense of like, hey, if you're a huge fan of horror films in 1999, if you live in a small town or whatever, like, yeah, you're going to be on the internet in these forums talking about films that you can't with people that are in your immediate circles or in your life and whatnot. And so I think in that regard, like this game does a really good job of capturing that analog time capsule version of the internet. And it does that in the various ways in which you can navigate within the computer. So it's like you can go into whoever's computers this is and dive into the, their forum history. You can see their inbox, their send box and whatnot. You can dive into different websites that they have saved. And it's like for, late 90s, what's the internet mostly? It's forums and porn, basically. And even though back in the day still for 90s internet, it was like cats also. None of that's connected. But you see the types of things that you could access on the internet. And this is more or less just like sort of, I suppose, a proper distillation of what the internet was used for in those eras. Granted, maybe that's mostly what the internet's still used for these days, those 3 categories. But I think that ultimately it does a good enough job of kind of just like letting the player exist in this world and, not really giving them a set objective, if you will. Now, that's not to say that the game itself isn't scaled very well. I think that the game is actually scaled incredibly well because of the fact that if you spend enough time just exploring and investigating the various avenues that the desktop will let you go down, like you more or less are going to discover a puzzle or two, which is going to essentially be uncovering passwords to go deeper down this rabbit hole of what's going on in this narrative, what is the files that you can't find. And so it has that very analog feel of like being this archivist of what you probably at the end of the day are not going to want to know about. But I think in that regard, like just through natural exploration, like it's fairly intuitive. You would have to really struggle, I think, to not have an idea of like how to progress in this game, even if it's
Yeah.
not spelled out for the player.
I know, yeah, and something kept coming back to me when I thought about that time, especially, and the Blair Witch Project was like a big part of why, because this game is the computer's main files tend to be around 1999, and there is even a porn parody of the Blair Witch Project in there. Yeah, it did remind me of why that was so effective back in the day. Yeah, the whole Blair Witch Project phenomenon online, because of just how new and fresh and exciting it was to delve into these things. And is it real? Like you had that. There was something about it. It was like, wow, maybe it could be like that. And you kind of want to know more, and it almost felt dangerous, in a way like that. And I think that's how this kind of thing feels for you as a user. It's like digital voyeurism, I suppose, is the best way to put it, isn't it? Like you're witnessing something, and it's morbidly fascinating and then horrifying the more you go into it. But it's just definitely exactly why that period of time feels perfect, maybe for this sort of game in that regard.
I think that's perfectly put. The nature of this like morbid fascination, because essentially what you are going to unearth is that some act of violence or some act of abuse was enacted against a woman, and so the more that you uncover about that is naturally very disturbing. And I think that what this game does such a good job of is replicating that rabbit hole effect of like, you're going down the rabbit hole because the player wants to unearth more information about what happened. And yet you already know from the opening moments of the game that information is going to be even more fucked up than what you expect it to be. And so it does replicate that in this like safe space kind of format of that notion of falling down a rabbit hole with either falling into like subcultures or just, our own morbid curiosity about things. And so I think the ability to like replicate that, whatever you want to call it, that like phenomena or that sort of like just feeling of going down this path that is quite dark, is something that is like pretty disturbing about this game overall. It was one of those games, I described it to you as, I would be hard pressed to kind of like be able to explain the appeal of this game if somebody walked in while I was playing this. Like, thankfully my girlfriend was out of the house, because the notion that I'd be able to explain this in a way that would be like, just even be able to communicate the value here, because she doesn't play games or doesn't like horror to begin with. But it's one of those things where it's like, to have played so many desktop horror games, that what is the kicker 90% of the time? It's like you get a loud screech and then a face pops up on the screen. To play an experience though that is able to really like truly unnerve you and like disturb you, but not have those sorts of like shock value tools. Like, it comes back to the reason that this game was supposedly banned, was that, it had depiction. It was, what was it? It was sexual depictions or sexual acts with real people or something like that, which is not content that's in this game at all. There's disturbing FMV visuals and, there's blood and there's some gore, but it is not in the realm of those things. And I don't think this game like overly relies on those visuals. You really have to like do some digging to uncover them, which, if anything, just like makes them more impactful, because once you do the digging and you get through like the challenge of this game, which is the investigatory piece, you get those visuals that investigatory and that sort of, that morbid fascination or curiosity is rewarded with, a bunch of disturbing visuals that I think the fact that it has that Blair Witch FMV kind of look to it, like that just makes it even more creepy and unnerving in a way that's very, very effective for an experience that I think you could say is like, what, an hour to 2 hours long at most. Like, it really utilizes that time distinction quite well, I think, and doesn't kind of like jump to its punchiness, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it took me just under 2 hours, I think, because, like I said, just a big part of that, I think, was note taking. One of the
Yeah.
things the game does quite well is having a note system, so you can just like piece things together.
Mhm.
You're not explicitly being told to solve a mystery here. Like the information is all there. You will find it. Like, but there's passwords and things and like that, and you're kind of playing a ghost of the computer's owner. In that regard, you are basically going over their steps, going through all their stuff. It's not just looking through the files and finding it in the normal sense. You are having to almost go through the timeline of how certain emails, certain documents, and going back and forth, finding new bits and pieces. And the note system helps sort of piece it all together. And I've definitely found in more recent years with a lot of games, especially puzzly things. I've definitely started taking notes more on my phone and just making sure to like short scribbles. Pretty much the same thing I do when we're doing podcasts. And in fact, they're almost identical. My notes for the podcast and my notes for the game itself in the game. In terms of just like trying to get a flavour of the story, and it's good because it makes you think about each little conversation as well that you come up against. I mean, early on, it's very clear that just from life, that there are people. The person who this PC this is one of those good guys. That's very much. I didn't do anything wrong, and blah blah blah. And there's many instances of that, where you get people saying, like in forums, saying, "Oh, well, I was, someone was rude to me because I was only asking for an autograph," and like then later you get like the actual sort of audio of it as well, and find out that you're missing a key detail out there of why you were refused, sort of thing. And there's constant bits like that, and that's kind of the obsession for the player, that is to find out, well, what did you do? What did happen here? And beyond that, I think you're making these notes and you're starting to piece it together, and then you get more information through the computer. It's the slow creeping dread realization of where this is going that really makes you go, oh, like that, which is a hell of a payoff in terms of like, as the developer says, it's raw horror. It's like there's no metaphor here. This is just what it is. This is the computer of someone who's horrid. And in ways that we will not be spoiling, but because I think if you're going to experience it, you're going to be in for a bad time. You're going to be seeing and hearing things that are disturbing. It's not graphic in that sense, but certainly in terms of like the text that does come up sometimes. There are things said that just make you ooh, like sometimes there's we'll get into the conversations in a bit, but in some of the stuff that's in it, but it is a part of why this feels so authentic. I think from personal experience for the developer Kara as well. Kind of making a lot of this what it is. And even the time period is interesting because this is the stuff that was coming out like a decade ago, where we started having more of these conversations, especially in the games industry, where this has background in that, with people being abusive and like that. Oh yeah, well, we thought it was okay, or like that, and like all these different stories from different angles and why people are protected. And it is brutal stuff in that regard. And there's a film I don't think's come out properly. Like I think it was a festival thing last year, or the year before, called Lucky Lou, which is basically like filmed from in a found footage kind of way by someone who's like stalking people. He like going into their houses and like you get to document how he just keeps pushing things a little bit further. Maybe it's just outside, then it's just in the door, then it's just in the house, then going into places, walking around the house. And it's disturbing. And like there's bits in this that just instantly reminded me of that, and like how creepy that could be. It is. Like I said, it doesn't work without that authenticity, and that note taking is like an integral part of that for me.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's the thing. And kind of what I was alluding to with the way in which the game kind of like sparingly doles out its more graphic images. Even before you get to that, this game is very fittingly in just like how stomach churning it can be just from reading the dialogue that you find in some of the files that you're unearthing, right? I think the moment that you mentioned was probably one of the best examples of how this game is being a commentary on, not only misogyny online, but ultimately like the way in which these people seem to operate within the fact that, you're messaging a website, bitching about the fact that you've been banned from it and you don't understand why. And I haven't done this and I haven't, violated terms of service. And then you dig around in the sent box and you see evidence that is to the contrary of that. And it's done so and written so in a way that it feels as if like you're unearthing evidence in any number of cases that we've read over the last 5 to 10 years about incidents involving in the game industry, right? Or just online in general about abuse and harassment and whatnot. And so I think the fact that Kara is able to take those real world experiences and drop it into this game or make it sort of like the backbone of the experience in a way that doesn't feel as if it's like shoving it in the player's face. And what I mean by that is that like you have to go through the natural steps of exploring the game. And so in finding that very naturally through the course of just exploring what's on this computer and not sort of like having this hand holding in terms of like steps to go through to progress your investigation, it comes across just a lot more effective, I think. Stumbling upon this realization rather than being led by the nose to it, so to speak, I think is quite effective in just like overall reinforcing the commonplace nature of it, or the sense of just like the player's own understanding of the individual whose files they're rummaging around in. I think that ultimately is what makes this quite effective at what it has set out to do, amongst a variety of other reasons. But why don't we take a quick break, and when we come back, we can dive more into that and some of perhaps the other features found within Vile Exhumed and the ways in which this game is able to, utilize horror, the vessel of horror, for its, thematic sort of relevance, even in our modern times, considering this is a game set in late 90s. It feels even more relevant than ever nowadays. So we'll have more on that in a moment.
It's the Smucker's Uncrustables podcast with your host, Uncrustables. Okay, today's guest is rough around the edges. Please welcome Crust.
Thanks for having me.
Today's topic, he's round with soft, pillowy bread.
Hey.
Filled with delicious PB&J.
Are you talking about yourself?
And you can take him anywhere.
Why'd you invite?
And we are out of time.
Are you really cutting me off?
Uncrustables are the best part of the sandwich. Sorry, Crust.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. When your computer breaks, you don't wait for it to magically start working again. You fix the problem. So why wait to hire the people your company desperately needs? Use Indeed's sponsored jobs to hire top talent fast. And even better, you only pay for results. There's no need to wait. Speed up your hiring with a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
Purina believes no one should have to make the impossible choice between their own safety and their pets. But nearly half of domestic abuse survivors delay leaving because they can't bring their pets with them. Through the Purple Leash Project, Purina is helping create more pet-friendly domestic violence shelters so survivors and their pets can escape and heal together. Visit Purina.com/purple to learn more.
And we're back from our break. And, the one aspect that we talked about a little bit was like in terms of the forms of chat that are here, right? We talked about the fact that you're going to be going through emails and you're going to be going through different forum postings and whatnot. I suppose, the one thing that we could talk a little bit about in that regard is, this game being, we call it a game and we view it as a game, but really it's like this piece of interactive fiction, I think, in terms of fact that the player is basically given these files and then it's up to them to go through them at their leisure and really decide what they want to prioritize, I suppose. This kind of like interactive fiction angle, does that provide Vile Exhumed like an inherent strength for the type of story it's telling over perhaps if they had gone like a more traditional route, I suppose?
Yeah, absolutely. I think because the context of this, if you're rummaging around in this, you're not given any reason why you'd be rummaging around in this, but the stuff is in there. Like I was saying earlier, it's this digital voyeurism where you just can't help yourself and you want to look and see where does this lead, where is this going, and like that, and that's the driving force. So I think that doesn't work without the right words that are coming at you on screen. And I think that the words need to be more than one thing here as well. As much as it's about the harsh, brutal truth of places, the forums were like that up until they start dying off. Like you would have people like that. I remember very distinctly people who talk like some of the people did in this, and they weren't on forums for like hardcore porn videos, like it's they were just being like that in general. So because it was a very male dominated space in a lot of places, and so naturally you're going to get this sort of machismo talk as it goes. I suppose given that how personal it must be, I think what's quite telling and quite helpful in terms of like this medium is it's not afraid to be funny too. Like there's stuff about it that's whether it's in the satire of like the pop-up ads, or it's there's literal like trolling moments in like where people are like requesting videos with certain titles and they turned out to be nothing like the sort of that happens near the end where there's like this video's title sent to the guy that sent it called like whole and oral and amateur, and every video has nothing to do with what you would think it would be. So it's just, and it's funny, but it's like in the context of what's going on, it's like it'd be bleak if you would just walk in and say, okay, no. But yeah, that makes it, a bit of levity does help it from being like a slog to get through, which it's understandable why it is a slog. So yeah, I think it's something that needs to rely on text a lot, and I think putting it in a traditional game format maybe would make that a slog in a different way. Like you'd really have to, say you did a first-person style game, like a narrative adventure like that. Yeah, you could do it, but then how do you construct it? How do you show some of these things like that? I mean, this got banned for nothing really, right? Because of the way it's structured. But if you were to make this game a game, like in terms of like a more traditional one, no, you so much you wouldn't be able to do without causing yourself issue, because the stuff is just too brutal and it relies so much on the detail, and even you can't do that visually as well as you can by text, I think. And here you can skimp on some of those details and leave in enough to give you the context. Like some of it's very blunt in your face, like the stuff on the forums where the way they behave and the way they see women and the way they talk, the user talks about like his fetishes and like the lengths he goes to. But yeah, it's the way it has to be. And I think when you have those really chilling sort of casual exchanges over emails about like videos and like the content of those videos, like there's this throwaway moment about like someone like, oh, I found this tape in a bunch of box of tapes like that, and it's got some stuff I really think you love like that. And then it goes on to talk about having a mother and a child in it, and that he'd never seen so much blood or heard so much screaming, and it's just like fucking hell, like we're getting into snuff territory here or something. It's like it just starts feeling like that, and it's like I said, that's where it just that's where you start to feel like you've overstepped where you are in it. Like that's where the game almost starts to trick you into thinking, Christ, why am I on my computer viewing this sort of thing like that?
Yeah.
Like that, and you realize, yeah, you are, but you're not, this sort of thing. And it's like, yeah, it's so effective, and I think it's the perfect sort of vehicle for sort of explaining where it all came from as well, really, as well. Like, there's no denying that, a lot of this stuff has bred online, and become, because it was always there. It's just, it got a light shone on it, and everything grew, and yeah, there were fewer places to hide and more places to lash out.
Yeah, I think ultimately the way in which this is able to be the most effective is because of what you've said, which is that a lot of it, the most disturbing instances for most of the experience, are you just reading and understanding, like, it's basically like alluding to the stuff that people are watching that obviously the player will not be shown, but ultimately, like, the gratification that these people are getting from what they're describing. And what they're describing does not go into it's not explicitly stating it, but then your mind starts to wander into what the content of that could actually be. And the fact that, you are not finding this in the inbox. Most of the stuff that you find like that, it's in their, it's either in the trash can or it's in like their sent folder. And sometimes you'll come across messages that are like, as soon as you read this, delete this. Now, we all know that nothing is ever truly deleted on the internet, but it speaks to, I think, the comfortability that some people had back in those days that were clearly engaging in far more nefarious things than anyone ever should. And yet there was this comfortability with exploring these grotesque, I suppose, tastes and inclinations, because they thought they had this level of anonymity on the internet, or ultimately like, oh, I'll just delete this and no one will ever find it. And so the notion that we're traveling back in time to an era where people felt more emboldened by the internet to do these things and to explore these cultures and these things, again, just like it adds to the kind of like sickly feel of this game that I think is quite effective and does most of the heavy lifting, which, I think in terms of capturing some of the feeling of being on the internet, like you said, like occasionally you'll get these moments of levity, which is like some pop-ups, right? You'll get these pop-ups that are either about, meet up for free sex or, an advert for Jesus or something like that. But then even still, like you'll get a couple of instances that are like more disturbing that are along those lines. And so it's like for every moment where you get this brief sense of like levity, that doesn't completely like make you want to get out of this because of how disturbing it gets. Like there is still that uppercut at the end of the day of just like, no, you might have a moment of levity here, but you sure as shit are not going to forget the type of experience that you're unearthing.
Yeah. Sorry. And just on levity as well, like little things like the video rental site that's got like some of the nasty stuff there, but also like the first page of it is all these really wholesome titles, and like I found that hilarious. In terms of like fake films as well, like the Lord of the Things, and then the plot description just being a mix of the Lord of the Rings and The Thing was just like, like I love that. That's my favorite gag of the whole thing. Yeah, it's definitely necessary though. You've definitely got a bit of that, but like you said, there's just no escaping like everything else.
Yeah, and I suppose that also kind of like ties in not so much the levity piece, but ultimately like exploring this computer and the files and whatnot in the player at the player's own discretion. Like that, I think, is what is most effective about this game. And I keep coming back to like the lack of hand holding or traditional sort of like, I suppose, spelled out milestones for narrative progression, is that a lot of what you're finding, and when you stumble upon it, that's what makes it the most disturbing, I think, is the fact you stumbled upon it very casually, like reading through AIM messages. And, they start off innocuous enough. It's just like bullshitting with a friend. And then you start to see like some misogynistic language that is presented very casually between two acquaintances. And then you go into a message and it's like with a coworker who is clearly not this person's like buddy. And yet the things that they divulge in that are reflective of the individual whose computer this is, it's like, oh, I just stumbled upon this. And this kind of made me like sick to my stomach a little bit in terms of maybe not so much the content in that instance, but it was more about like alluding to something that happened that was quite serious. And I think not having that spelled out right away is one of those things that like builds tension in a way that's very natural, that's very gradual. And then once you get to, you know, unearthing some of the documents and videos, that's when it really has that payoff. There's a lot of alluding to things that lets your mind kind of like, and then once you unearth certain truths or facts, it does become a lot more, you know, dastardly, if you will. But I suppose like the game's use of multimedia, how did you find that in sort of like further showcasing some of the horrors behind this person that whose computer you're navigating?
I think it seems glib to say, you know, it adds variety to the experience to have a bit. I did wonder if it would have it, to be honest. The way it was going, I thought, okay, probably show my age thinking, would there be videos? Because surely it would take 5 fucking years to download if that was the case. Like, because it's 2000. But yeah, it doesn't matter. I think the use of it is scarce enough that when it does come up, it's like a sick reward, effectively, for like you're investigating. Like you'll find, you know, there's a game on this, you know, where like an actual game where you use one of those old sort of press direction, go around the corridors, doing a sort of Bloody Mary riff, basically, in that game.
It was a little bit like a dungeon crawler.
Yeah, it was like dungeon crawler meets Bloody Mary sort of thing, and that was cool in itself. You know, like I think the first time you like get audio, like a user called, I guess, Nameless Norm, you know, like who says, also to just provide context, going back a step here, that one of the core things in this game is like forums around a like hardcore porn star, you know, like called Candy Corpse, and like that she's stopped doing films and like she has this fandom, but they have a parasocial relationship with her. You know, this is very much about the birth of that. And Nameless Norm is like this guy who says that he met her in real life, and when he asked for an autograph, she was rude and didn't give him one, like that, and like calling her name, all kinds of names under the sun on the forums about it, and like, you know how forums go, you know, messages go with those kind of people even today. But later, you know, you uncover the audio, and like a common theme in this is the men in any of these instances, like, will say they don't understand what they did wrong or what happened wrong, like that. And it's like every time the answer is pretty much like, how could you not see what you've done wrong? It's like you can, you just don't want to admit that you've done something. And in the context of that, it's like, yeah, Norm basically casually says something disgusting to her after, you know, when she's fine about an autograph and a picture like that, and he adds in something that makes her change her mind. So like that was the first incident, and using audio for the first time was like quite powerful. Hearing it instead of like reading it, because you wouldn't find it that other way. And I think it's a tool the game uses quite well, is using video and audio especially to like show something outside of what we're being told, you know, in the text a lot of the time. And certainly towards the back end, I think when like the video clips really start coming in, as glib as some of them are, you know, in terms of like being like troll videos and stuff like that, the really disturbing stuff that happens towards the end is just like I said, when I was talking about that film Lulu, that's the one it reminded me of. It starts to become like this voyeuristic sort of found footage sort of thing, and like the culmination of what you've seen up to this point, and knowing where it's going because of all the notes you've made and all the connections you've made, and it's just hits at the right time, you know, like that. It's the punchline you didn't want.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that instance when you go digging through the trash and you find that video where the video itself is corrupted, but you still have the audio. Like, that's one of the most fucking depraved instances of multimedia in this game because of the fact, again, it reinforces this notion of you're given certain facts about this, but then your mind kind of like runs wild with setting the stage itself. And I'm glad you also mentioned the Mary, mini game, which I think is, again, like really strong in terms of like utilizing another form of media that goes against what a majority of the experience is. But even in that, in experience that, you more or less know what it's building towards, like, it kind of just like, it resets your expectations for the overall experience because it's something new, because it's something different. And even if it maybe is not largely in service of the narrative of what you're uncovering, it still is unnerving, right?
Yeah, I mean, you say that, but I think it is a bit, because I think the implication is that, he has something to do with that game. And given the context of what that game says about I shouldn't be here, like that, and trying to avoid the windows in the place in this building he's not supposed to be in, and what he does later, it's like putting himself into that game effectively, or finding media that is connected to what he wants, like that. And so, yeah, in a way, I think it does add a bit of context and add to the story in that regard.
That's fair. I think I more meant just like the notion of like that is a way for him to live through that without actually speaking to the notion of like it's continuing the narrative in that regard. But no, you're 100% correct with that, which I suppose makes it even more disturbing, right? Because it's like, how are you able to get into the mindset of this person? And it's like, they're not going to spell out what they did, which I think, again, is, a strong suit of this, in that you're not unearthing a diary entry that says, oh, I did this or I did that, which would be very on the nose. But this is how you're exploring this person's basically like omission, or the notion that like this is how they're able to sort of like express things that they've done or desires that they have in ways that utilize art, perhaps. But I think that like between aspects such as that and like the videos, whether it's all audio and visual or just the audio, I found that this game just does such a great job ultimately of exploring a really disturbing corner of not only the internet, but also of, just like subcultures and male dominated subcultures at that, and doing so in a way that was like, again, just letting people coexist in a world that they would never want to exist in without being hand-holding. Because when you get into the notion of like hand-holding in terms of an investigatory aspect such as this game has, I don't know, it could come across as being just too on the nose. So giving players the freedom that you would need with this, and unearthing those things through their own detective work, and uncovering passwords through, not only hints, but also just like exploring their history and whatnot and learning about them. So the more you learn about this person, and as is the truth of any aspect of investigating something or someone, you get to know them more and more. And this is clearly someone you don't want to know about at all, but to fully experience this game and the narrative there within, you really do have to get on a one-to-one basis with them, even if that's against the players' every sort of like inclination of the people they want to be associated with.
And I think as well, like you're mentioning about like the stuff that doesn't get mentioned and hiding what you're doing, what you are, like you can see that certainly the more you get into this as well, that like these sort of like, there are certain spaces that talk freely, and then like towards the back half there's a whole thing of a person like where it starts to become very clear that something happened in an interaction between this guy and someone else, like that. And then you get like the instant messages between them, where she's basically talking about it, like, and he never mentions what he did. No, he leaves it very vague, and then gaslights into saying, "Oh, I thought you'd like this. I thought, I never meant to do this to you. I never meant to hurt you," sort of thing. That sort of thing. Yeah, typical sort of abuse talk. And yeah, like you said, always hiding it, and yet almost like feeling compelled to like let more and more of themselves stay there to be caught for these things, because like you mentioned about the messages and like where constant things about deleting the messages after you've said that. and well, they're on the computer. So like it's like they don't get deleted. It's like he's so blasé about it. Like, oh yeah. Like it's like he feels like he can get away with it and what he does, and that's chilling enough. And I think again, part of this sort of internet space as we've been talking about and how it was and how it's dark rooms and shady corners that you don't go to, and like once a light shone on them, they kind of all scatter out and all around the internet and make it worse. But like those dangerous corners like this are just something quite disturbing in terms of like the context and the content that you get out of it in this game.
Yeah, and again, like the notion, like we started when we were chatting about this game, the fact that this is the type of game that I think is exactly what makes the horror genre so special, and the ability to utilize horror as this vessel for, this sort of like thematic exploration of cultures or subcultures that are still prevalent to this day. Again, despite the fact this acts as like the way back machine to presenting the internet and forum culture and these things, like what this game is actually tackling is more relevant now than perhaps it's ever been. And so the fact that this is the type of experience and narrative that would be shunned from the two biggest platforms out there is, further reinforcing this notion that like censorship of art, especially when it's bad faith, right? That's the only reason why this was banned. Because I think I even said it at the beginning, like the reasons this was stated for being banned could not be further from the content of the actual game. There is nothing in this game that is for the reason that this was supposedly banned. And so the fact that like we have these bad faith arguments that are coming from these groups that are not coming in to conversations with good faith and are actively censoring art that is an active expression. And at the end of the day, like is providing a worthwhile commentary is furthermore just like it's very disturbing. I think that we're seeing these platforms such as Steam or itch.io that are basically like bowing at the behest of, profits and those that help them to secure those profits because they are themselves, succumbing to those groups and whatnot. So it's a shame that a game such as Vile Exhumed would fall under that level of scrutiny when it actually has an incredibly important message and is well worthwhile in that regard in exploring its narrative. But thankfully, they made the decision to release this for free. And there, as I said at the beginning of the episode, there's going to be links below this episode's social post, both on Twitter and Safe Room Pod, to not only where you can download this game, which is now shareware, so that means it's free, but also the donation link to not only provide donations and compensation to developer and publisher, but this is being, the 50% of those are being sent to a group that is going out of its way to, support women of both domestic violence and refugees and whatnot, and just supporting people that are attempting to escape violent situations. So there's a very worthwhile cause there in actually visiting that PayPal link and whatnot, and supporting people who, hopefully they are not experiencing the same type of abuse that was in this game, but that's an unfortunate reality of our world.
Yeah, it very much is. And this has been a very difficult game to sort of talk about as a game because of its structure, but also, even with the content as well, because it's tricky to say, like, you should experience it for yourself. But quite clearly, there are going to be people that don't want to for very obvious reasons, and that is absolutely fine. And so we tried the best we can to sort of encapsulate why it feels the way it does and what it is. And sometimes straightforward, like, reality is enough for horror because it's there. And I know people find horror to be escapism and like that, but the feelings you feel from horror are all very different. Like revulsion and is like a big part of that in many forms. And I think it's important to have games that remind you of more than just like the boogeymen of a supernatural kind.
Yeah, I think that for as much as we love and revere the genre for its like escapist aspects of its storytelling and the monsters there within, like at the same time that speaks to, again, the malleability of the horror genre, and that you can utilize genre and perhaps some tropes to tell these human experiences, but you can also get games like Vile, Exhumed, that are able to act as like a time capsule and present things in a format that, you know, even if they're not always going to be relatable to everybody that was on the internet from this period, like it still sets a very moody primer to examine, you know, behaviors that are still very prevalent to this day, which kind of just reinforces that thematic notion of like, we tend to think people have come a long way and society's come a long way, but unfortunately in some aspects of that regard, we've not come nearly as far as we have. So yeah, it's one of those games that it's difficult to say like, I don't know, it's difficult to be like, oh, I enjoyed this game. But I think that this is a game that deserves to be praised for just how effective it is at what it sets out to do. And ultimately, this is the type of game that it takes a special creative, I think, to as succinctly and as eloquently utilizing the medium of games to tell a story that's as important as this. And so, yeah, I think just for that, it's very much well worth checking out, and everyone certainly should.
Yeah, absolutely.
But that's going to do it for our chat this week for Safe Room, that being Vile Exhumed. As I mentioned several times throughout this episode, below a link for this, you'll be able to find the download links for shareware version of this game, as well as the links to donate and whatnot. But until next time, my friend, as always, it's a pleasure chatting horror with you for Safe Room.
Okay, my man. Until the next time.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Safe Room. If you enjoy the show, please rate us on iTunes and follow us on Twitter and Blue Sky at Safe Room Pod for show updates. As always, our main episodes of Safe Room drop every Monday, but our bite-sized episodes of Horror Bites, our indie horror showcase, drop every Thursday. You can follow the Horror Bites Twitter account at horrorbites_SR. You can join our Discord channel, Safe Room Podcast, to chat with us and other horror fans about the genre we all love. And finally, you can send emails to saferoompod@gmail.com if you'd like to share your thoughts on a game we have or are going to cover. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you guys next week.